reputation as an expert on the social credit system. He works with us as an associate analyst. His research also focuses on digital media and cyber governance. Vincent has worked for the Consulate General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Shanghai, and he studied at the Leiden Asia Center. Okay, and that said, I would open the floor to Katja and Vincent. Looking forward to your talk. Katja, do I need to unmute you?
No, thank you, Claudia. And if you could move us to the first slide of our presentation.
Absolutely. The graphic, or do you want to move this even further? Here?
And no, this is where we start with the graphic.
Okay, here you go.
Thank you very much. We thought we'd start with the graphic because what we try to encompass in here is essentially our key takeaways, which I'll summarize briefly and we'll discuss in more detail in our presentation. So the first finding, and that has been written about by other scholars for a while, but it bears repeating, is that the social credit system is really a complex and fragmented and relatively low-tech initiatives. It is not a unified system, but more a system of systems that help enforce policies nationally and locally is where really the greatest variation occurs. The second finding is that we currently see how the system moves gradually, but step by step towards deeper standardization and integration. And this is also reflected in newer policy documents and especially the agenda items in the new 5-year plan. The last thing before we jump into the details that we feel really bears special emphasis is that the social credit system is just one part of the bigger puzzle, really, of the party states' quest for data-driven governance and the numerous and often more invasive monitoring and surveillance initiatives that exist. And Claudia, if you could move us to the next slide, we'll start with a quick guide to China's social credit system, just to kind of compare a bit also the international, or the picture that the international reporting has often painted of the system and what it currently looks like. So especially the year 2020, could you move one slide back, please? Especially the year 2020 has been presented as the year where the social credit system will be switched on. But that's not really the case. Parts of the system, especially different blacklists, have already been built up and in use for years. And social credit itself is quite an ambiguous term, and it's more an umbrella term for various national and local initiatives that all strive to build trust in society and especially in market actors. This also links back to who the main target group of the system is. Because when we looked at regulatory documents on the system, we found that it is predominantly trying to target and regulate companies, as you can also see in the short visual on the slide. The primary goal of the system really is not tracking individual behavior, but enforcing laws and regulations, and counter to what is often, again, presented, just because it also seems so intuitive, is that there is no unified score, but rather the opposite. Individuals and companies have unified identification numbers to aggregate information in different databases and essentially in digital files, but those are partly scattered as well. And on the topic of scattering, Claudia, if you could move us to the next slide. Thank you. So the difficult part about researching the social credit system is that you first have to find it in the jungle of legal documents, regulations, and party documents. As you can see in the bar chart, I hope, is that the number of social credit related documents has risen sharply over the years. And that doesn't start only in 2014 with a big planning outline, but has already been in the works in the years before. Overall, the social credit system is regulated by myriad normative documents. A social credit law is still in the making. So for now, the main national platforms, which is the Credit China platform, but also the site of the State Council, contain hundreds and hundreds of documents of very mixed relevance and quality. So you have press statements, you have really important regulatory documents, all mixed in one. So our assumption is that even for Chinese researchers and policymakers, it is equally different to kind of find the needle of social credit in the haystack of written words that can be found on those platforms. So what we did is summarize and categorize and tag these different and filter these different documents to arrive at a set of a few hundred documents that we use as the basis for our analysis. But it has to be said that thousands more documents are published on ministerial, provincial and local government sites that could not be included in the study, which is why, especially my colleague Vincent, who will talk soon, has focused on looking at local practices to see if national priorities and practices are reflected on the local level. The general finding is that in 2021, the social credit system has been firmly established. National policies provide the guidance, local policies focus on specific implementation, as is generally the case in Chinese politics and political implementation. And a clear finding is that most regulations and mechanisms are already institutionalized. Those are the documents marked red in the bar chart, whereas the number of temporary documents or pilot projects is relatively low. So again, this is not switched on in 2020, but has been steadily implemented. And a growing number of laws refer to the social credit system for enforcement, meaning it is being used and linked to, and it is already functioning as sort of a sidekick or support pillar for the legal and administrative system. And Claudia, if you could move us to the next slide. Thank you. Another key finding really is that the social credit system allows targeted and campaign style enforcement. And what that means is that it is a very flexible tool where a number of Chinese government organs under the leadership of the NDRC and State Council can release their own regulations of various degrees of normative power. And these rulemakers have used their powers to focus on very current and on very current issues that are high on the political agenda. And based on that, there's a visible shift of issues and issue areas over time within sectors. One recent example is, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic that in the colorful bar chart you can see marked up as red, which just has become a political challenge in the past year, and where social credit regulations were relatively quickly trained on the issue, with the national level more focused on setting regulations and mitigation, so companies aren't adversely affected by debt, for example, whereas local governments were more keen on using their regulatory power for enforcement and enticement, for example, for punishing people not wearing masks or rewarding hospitals, for example, in their area that were contributing to treatment. What this means also is a relatively fragmented landscape. And this is where I hand over to my colleague Vincent to discuss a bit more about how that fragmented landscape looks like. And Claudia, if you could move us to the next slide as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And indeed, so in this part, we shift our focus away from kind of the more abstract policy making towards this everyday implementation in Chinese cities. And to do so, we analyzed the 28 Chinese model cities for the construction of the social credit system that were announced in 2018 and 2019. And together, these pilot cities really serve as a blueprint for national implementation. They are what the Chinese government considers a balanced representative mix of the most successful social credit system implementations to date. So they really reflect the future direction, but also all the challenges that come associated with the system. And if you could go to the next slide, please. The first really clear challenge, and Katja already hinted at this, is that these pilot initiatives reflect a high degree of fragmentation of the. So although there is national level policy guidance that makes sure the noses remain roughly in the same direction, that make sure nothing too out of the ordinary happens, we nevertheless see that great levels of fragmentation occur. And we divide this in kind of three main causes, three main levels. The first is simply that different cities, different departments have different focal areas. So for instance, a city like Shanghai may focus more on international trade, whereas the city of Chengdu may have its own focal areas. And that means that simply some sectors are enforced more strictly in some cities, whereas others may be ignored a bit more in these same cities, or vice versa. The second point is that cities, departments have a lot of leeway to develop supplementary local regulations. So they can add categories, they can add extra clauses for blacklisting, which mean that they can expand the scope beyond what national level policy outlines. Lastly, cities and again different departments have the right to develop proprietary evaluation systems. By this, I mean basically everything ranging from a scoring system to a traffic light system to a grade A, B, C, D text ranking, any kind of evaluation that you can possibly imagine. Cities have developed their own versions of it. And this level of fragmentation then directly translates into some levels of ambiguity for the social credit system. The first is very simple. It leads to differences in enforcement. What is okay in one city, or what is perhaps tolerated or not as strictly enforced in one city, can directly lead to blacklisting in another city. And then the procedures by which that happen also differ, and similarly the procedures for how you can then get off these blacklists. The second point is that it leads to arbitrary application beyond the intended scope. And there are quite some examples in our report, for instance, that we discussed related to, for instance, COVID, where it can be used to also punish rumor spreaders. The social credit system has also been in various instances been applied or suggested that it would be used in Inner Mongolia to enforce education regulations and to ensure that everyone receives Mandarin language education. So there's a risk that the social credit system becomes arbitrarily applied beyond its scope. And then the figure on the left very aptly shows that fragmentation that has all led to that. And if you could go to the next slide. The second main challenge is that although the social credit system is often envisioned as this very digitized system, the reality on the ground is that it's very analog. And this is very visible, especially visible in the scoring systems that have popped up in China since basically 2016. These scoring systems have become almost synonymous with the social credit system in foreign coverage of it. But in reality, we found that they remain a very minor part, largely inconsequential and very lowly digitized kind of initiative. This is reflected in a couple of ways. First of all, cities are no longer allowed to punish citizens for having low scores by national decree from the state council. So what that means is that these scoring systems are developing almost more like loyalty programs, like we know them for airliners. The only difference is that the rewards are so minor in most cases that only very few people actually use these scoring systems. So in many cities, only 1 to 2% of the citizens has even activated their points accounts, let alone how many people then actually use it on a regular basis. Another point is that although these scoring systems were often envisioned, perhaps also in China to some degree, to use behavioral data, like if you play video games or AI traffic cameras that spot jaywalking. In reality, almost all the data that goes into the system is basically digitized administered data. So data that is often already in the hands of the government in one way or another is being put in digital formats and then translated according to a huge Excel sheet into different scores. Also looking more broadly at kind of the data and the digitization of the system in the broadest sense, we find that fundamental issues for digitization remain. And this comes back immediately to this idea of fragmentation. Because every city, each department does its own thing and is allowed to do its own thing, there is a large emergence of data islands. The idea that basically every city does its own thing and doesn't share data with other departments, either because of inconsistent standards, because they do not like to work together, and more. The data that goes inside the system then itself is often of low quality, very irrelevant and inflated. So you'll probably see the Chinese government announce statistics like that they have collected over 60 billion pieces of credit data. But when you then look at the chart on the left-hand side of the screen, you see that very little data is actually immediately relevant for citizens. So for instance, in Suzhou, the third bar in the middle, only 12% of the 13% of the citizens had received a single score change after 3 years in operation. And that just goes to show that, again, the social credit system is this very analog system for now. But how that will develop in the future, I will hand back over to my colleague Katja.
Thanks, Vincent. And here I don't want to just discuss the future of the social credit system per se, but more broadly the vision of the Chinese government, and especially of the party leader and state leader Xi Jinping, because a definite buzzword of recent years has been smart governance. And the leadership really sees data-driven governance as the way forward for China, also to make its political system more competitive and attractive as a model internationally. So smart governance, internet plus monitoring, anything to do with digital have been recurring catchphrases in government documents. And the underlying belief really is that data-driven or data-based monitoring are key to efficient governments, because after all, if you have collected qualitative information on societal and market actors and individuals, you know who is trustworthy, the key word of the social credit system, and whom to award, for example, contracts, services, whom to give preferential treatment. So this big drive for data gathering is also framed as a way to streamline bureaucracy, because all the information will be there and ready to come to quick decisions. But it is also driving a real hunger for data that obviously also creates new obligations, for example, for companies to collect and hand in data to the government. Overall, there is an evolving ecosystem of different monitoring and surveillance initiatives, and this really bears mentioning again, because the social credit system is so often envisioned as kind of a party-headed panopticon, really, of digital control that looks into every corner of Chinese society and life. But that's not really the case, as we've just learned and really found confirmed by our research of the regulatory environment. A large number of much more invasive monitoring and surveillance systems are in place. These are not the focus of today's discussion, but just to mention the different censorship systems that are in place that are keeping the Chinese internet relatively locked off from the global internet, with very advanced content monitoring and censorship mechanisms. You have public security organ-driven platforms for maintaining social stability, for collecting information on citizens. And there has been a large buildup really in monitoring capabilities on the ground, in the sense of cameras being built up to monitor public spaces. And this really also has been highlighted by COVID-19, how the government has also successfully used the available tech-driven solutions in hand with just human investigations on the ground. One interesting fact to mention is that the other systems are equally characterized by fragmentation and data islands. So across different sectors of data used to govern, there is a big interest in finding solutions to integrate data, to standardize, and to make it ready for big data analysis and added value. Within the role of this growing ecosystem, I think it's important to stress again that the social credit system itself is not tasked with individual surveillance and behavior tracking, but monitoring with compliance with laws and regulations. But what that also means is that it is especially important to look at how China's laws and regulations evolve, because there's a growing drive, for example, to use regulation to, for example, implement the socialist core values, to drive moral behavior of citizens, and to codify that in existing norms. And the social credit system doesn't enforce just essentially good regulation, such as environmental protection laws, but obviously it also can be used to enforce repressive or exclusionary norms, like restrictions on civil liberties or restrictions on the scope that companies can do business in. The goal really of the social credit system is general deterrence through highly visible, public, and severe punishments, but only of a few, because a key finding of our analysis was also that a very small percentage of companies are even affected or targeted by any change in their social credit status or related blacklist sanctions. This is included in the report as well. So the general goal it serves by its public nature is trust building. Hence, the system itself needs to be relatively fair and transparent. And Claudia, if you could move us to the next slide. This also connects to the future vision of the social credit system. So digitization and application of AI, big data, and so on are relatively likely to remain limited in scope, at least in the context of the social credit system, just because it can easily affect the wrong people or lead to over-implementation. Rather, there will be a slow but steady road to standardization, where the government is trying to walk a tightrope between standardization and flexibility, which means being able to continue to use the social credit system on emerging political issues and important agenda points. There is so far no ready-made solution to overcome data sharing challenges, but standardization and integration are key tasks outlined for the next phase, which are also reflected in the priorities set in the section on the social credit system in the new 5-year plan, which is essentially focused on establishing central legislation, standardizing procedures, improving data sharing, but also enhancing credit repair, and thereby addressing many of the issues that my colleague Vincent just outlined. Nonetheless, there are, or for the coming years, there will remain issues and challenges and risks for Chinese and foreign entities alike, which are rooted in, one, the poor information provision to companies and individuals, just by the very fragmented nature of the regulatory system, as well as the fact that what is accepted in one city may lead to blacklisting in another. So all actors really need to be able to navigate the maze of both regulations and blacklists that is in place. As an extension of the existing legal and administrative system, the social credit system is not automated, but it's still open for political and individual influence and abuse of power, because after all entries are based on administrative decisions by humans that have been made before information is entered. Also, the unclear procedures for credit repair remain in place for now, and any standardization there will only advance slowly just because of the current fragmented nature. And with that, Claudia, if you could move us to the very last slide. I hope this was serving you well as a quick introduction, and we are ready to answer any of your questions in the following discussion. And we hope that our lead graphic was able to visualize the many complex and contradictory findings we included in our report.
Thank you, Katja and Vincent, for this presentation. If I just briefly summarize, which is not really possible given the scope of the topic, we do see a lot of fragmentation. This brings about challenges and risks for the companies and individuals that are drawn into the social credit system. So there is questions to ask whether China will ever manage to have this overall integrated system they envision. But what we also see is a high degree of dedication to roll this out and really make this data-driven governance happen at some point. We do not know when this will become a reality, but as I said, China's government is really keen on having this in place at some point. And Katja and Vincent just showed that there's just a lot of activity going on, and this is really to be taken seriously. I thank everyone who watched this presentation on video on our website or on YouTube.